Hey, I'm Chen, political scientist, consultant, and commentator, and today we're talking about Minnesota. If you've been following the news, you know the names Renee Good, Alex Peretti, Don Lemon, and there's so many questions about ICE's operation in the Twin Cities. Specifically today, though, we're going to focus on the rights. What constitutional rights are being practiced, what are being violated, and this gives us a little bit of an idea of what courts are going to do. So 3 specific constitutional rights are front and center in the situation in Minnesota. First up is the First Amendment, and specifically the First Amendment's rights to free speech, the right to petition, and the right to assemble. This means that as Americans, we can speak our minds, we have the right to gather with others, and we have the right to petition our government for a redress of grievances, meaning we can speak our minds even when the government disagrees with the content. But there are limits to free speech, specifically something we call time, place, and manner. When you speak, where you speak, and how you speak matters. Large rallies, large protests in the streets of Minnesota are largely okay, but if they're beginning to disrupt people's sleep at night, then there might be some regulations around them. The protest that occurred at a church, probably not okay because it is private property instead of public property. And so these are some of the issues that we should be paying attention to as these cases start moving through the courts. The second right that we're going to see is the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. After the shooting of Alex Peretti, a number of people in the Trump administration made the suggestion that Peretti was carrying a firearm, specifically a 9mm with 2 clips, which is what's recommended when you take concealed carry classes, to carry 2 clips. And some suggested that because he was carrying a weapon, this meant he was forfeiting his rights, or that he was a threat, and therefore the shooting was justified. This is simply not the case. The Second Amendment guarantees the right of every American citizen to bear arms, with some exceptions, such as criminal records and so forth. But if you have the right to bear arms, you have the right to carry those arms to, say, a public place, such as a protest. The only time when engagement of federal law enforcement or of any law enforcement is permitted is when there is a perceived threat, not simply because a gun owner has shown up with their firearm at a public event. Again, there are limitations to the Second Amendment, often that deal with public versus private properties. A private store may tell people that they're not allowed to carry their firearms onto the premise of that store. College campuses may be gun-free zones, but in public, there's really very few restrictions about carrying a firearm. Those Second Amendment rights are guaranteed. And lastly, we can look at the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment guarantees what we call states' rights, that any right or power not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution is reserved by the states. So there's a large question about whether or not the federal government is allowed to send ICE agents into cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul, and whether or not states and localities are allowed to be sanctuary cities where they don't listen to federal law. This is a more complicated situation, but essentially the breakdown is such. Federal law reigns supreme. And so when federal law says that a certain immigrant or undocumented person or illegal immigrant is not permitted to be, say, working in a certain city, cities are not supposed to disregard those laws. Federal law enforcement is permitted to come in, such as ICE. They are permitted to enter these cities. However, the Supreme Court is very clear in Prince versus United States that the federal law enforcement cannot delegate their duties to local law enforcement. If the federal government wants to deport someone, they need to be the ones that go and arrest the individual, set up their court date, try them in court, and eventually deport them. Federal action must be done by federal government agents. However, cities and states don't always have the right to push back, especially if it's a federal law in question. State and local governments are allowed to pass laws that deal with state and local issues, but not laws that interfere with federal laws. This is a core doctrine in the founding of the United States called federalism, and the idea is it prevents any one branch or level of government from becoming too powerful and becoming a dictatorship. So as you're following along the events in Minnesota and potential court cases that come, be on the lookout for those 3 constitutional rights to be brought up: the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and the 10th Amendment. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this was helpful as you begin to parse through some of these issues. And remember, as always, as Americans, exercise your right to speak, your right to vote, because this is a government that is built by the people and for the people. Again, my name is Chen. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you again next time.